I am convinced that out of anywhere that you could sort of move and be an immigrant, Newark is, which is ironic given its reputation, the best place. It was difficult, but I was very much surrounded by people who had gone through the same experience. So I wasn't alone. Um, and looking back, I now understand just how meaningful that was. I didn't quite see it then like that, but um, it is sort of meaningful to be new in a place where you're surrounded by other people who are also new, and no one belongs to it, and everyone is sort of trying to find their way. Yeah, but I do
Well,
feel like a Jersey girl.
age 14 feels like a tough age to move.
It was totally, a freshman in high school. Um, I felt in my head like an adult. I I wasn't. But you sort of start to develop your identity as a person. You don't quite feel like a child. And it's like it was a tough transition.
Did you rebel? I mean, like first of all, what instigated the move? Like why did you move at that age? Like why did your family come to Newark then?
Yeah. My parents has sort of there was a recession in the DR. My dad lost his job. It was hard to find employment. My mom hadn't worked in years. At the same time, my aunt and other family members had sort of done that migration to New York City that a lot of Dominican people do. And so they found themselves sort of seeing the quality of life or our quality of life decrease. Like I attended a private school in a DR and suddenly they couldn't afford that private school anymore. That had been unemployed for over a year at this point. He was in debt. And so this was, the best move for them. They did have family in New Jersey and New York City. And so, yeah, they made that choice.
And there you
Um,
were. What
yeah,
and were you like in terms of arriving and adjusting to life in this new? I mean, you're not only moving towns, you're moving country, and you
yeah,
arrive as a freshman in high school, and you say Newark was a fairly welcoming place
yeah,
for people in your situation. It wasn't like you moved to like Des Moines, Iowa or something and dropped
right.
into some high school.
Correct.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you had like a relatively easy time making friends and stuff.
Yeah, I made friends relatively quickly. Like I remember, I landed in this high school that was so very diverse and everyone was from somewhere else. And my peers were from Central America, some were from South America, and everyone was like, oh, and where are you from? And that was like that sort of very special interaction that I had never experienced before. All of a sudden I'm like listening to people speak Spanish with a completely different accent, from like Honduras or Mexico. It's like we sound very different. And people had, like rivalries in terms of like, well, we don't get along with these guys. We don't get along with this other country. That sort of dynamic, which was like entirely new to me. And then there were immigrants from, Eastern Europe, and I had never heard someone speak Polish before, or Russian, or immigrants from Africa. Like I've never met anyone from Nigeria. So it was like very diverse in a really funny and just unique way. Um, and I think that, yeah, at the end of the day, we were all kids and people were just trying to make friends.
I feel like it sounds
Um,
like a good education to
it
be in
was.
a group of people that diverse and to have a sense of kinship with people who are new to the country and like all of you in or at least a lot of you
Yeah.
adjusting.
Yeah. A lot of us were, some people had been in the country a little longer than others, but Um, like I'll never forget. I had this classmate of mine, and we didn't find this out until senior year. We were applying to college, and we happened to notice that our social security numbers were like almost the same because we had entered the country at almost the exact same time. So for the last four digits, it was like, oh, wait a second, it's like all the other digits are identical. And that was just like funny. And then it's like, oh wait, when did you come in? It's like, oh, like we moved in August. And it's like, oh, we moved in November. I guess we were at the Social Security office picking up our cards around the same time. And the numbers were more or less the same. Yeah, like little funny things like that.
So, in terms of your literary education and your gravitation towards writing, I'm curious to know about early influences and if you brought some of that with you from the DR, or if you kind of got hooked into it in like high school in the States or later in college. Like what was the introduction for you?
Yeah, I mean, I read since I was very young. My mom was a very avid reader. Mostly just, someone who sat in the morning and like read the newspaper cover to cover, read her books. Like my grandmother had a little sort of library area in her house. It was like a den at a library, but in my mind it was because it had a bookshelf from like wall to wall. And she had Dominican encyclopedia. She had Agatha Christie's books translated to Spanish, or those that happened to be other books. So like I grew up sort of reading whatever she had available, reading the newspaper. I liked as a kid, like I was introduced to like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but not the really difficult things, but like the shorter stories and the shorter books. Yeah, that's just a love that I developed from before I moved, and then once I made it to Newark, it was just making that transition from reading in Spanish to reading in English, which took some time, but my love for reading remained the same.
Yeah. What about like language stuff, like moving to the States? You clearly must have spoken some English before you got here.
I wasn't fluent. I knew some basic things. And the thing about growing up in the DR, in the town where I'm from, is that I was, close to the beach, near resorts. So, I did see tourists, did listen to people speak in English. I had family members that did travel from the US to the DR. So they would often speak to one another in English. Also, pop culture was like huge. So I grew up watching, not always understanding, but like Charmed would be on TV, or
Wait, what
like
was Charmed? What was that all about?
Charmed, the TV show with the
Yeah, I know.
witches.
Yeah, I know. Oh, it's about witches.
Yeah, yeah. um Charmed would be on TV, and like, I would like sometimes like read the captioning, but I was like listening to it and I didn't really understand. Like, there's so many things that I watched and listened to as a kid that I had no idea what it meant. But people were sort of bringing these American, things, this cultural items to me, and I was sort of ingesting, and then later on remembering, it was like, oh, that makes sense now. That's what that means. Like I remember my cousins were visiting once, and they brought these like VHS tapes, and one of them was like Rumble in the Bronx, that movie with Jackie Chan. And I watched Rumble in the Bronx, oh my God, a dozen times at least, never knowing what was going. I still don't know what that movie is about because I've never watched it as a person who speaks English, but as a kid, I was just like fascinated. Um, you know, and you sort of develop an ear. So like I couldn't really produce language, but I had been exposed to it for quite some time. Like I loved Britney Spears and I loved Christina Aguilera, like any child of the 2000s. I loved all the boy bands. I like loved Linkin Park. And, like I loved, buying a CD and like reading through the lyrics, even though I didn't really understand what anything meant. That came later on. Yeah, like I remember listening to Nirvana for the first time while I was in the DR, and like finding out that they no longer existed as a band, and I felt so cheated. I was like, I just discovered this wonderful thing and they don't exist anymore.
Right.
Feels so unfair. Almost like living a little bit in the past and finding all these new things, and it's like, oh, that's what that means. Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting how culture can like give people, I think, like at least a rough education in the language. Like
Yeah.
it's there in some kind of abstract way. And I relate to your ability to sort of hear the language spoken and to be able to glean meaning, but not to be able to produce it. I think that's a natural part of the learning curve for a language.
It is, yeah.
And it's where I exist with like Spanish and French, which I'm trying to learn, where I'm at the point where I think like if I'm sitting around and I'm listening to people speak Spanish, I can kind of get the gist.
Hmm.
But if it gets to the point where I'm supposed to participate in the conversation, I'm just like a two-dimensional, like stuttering, like I don't have the words.
Output takes longer. Output. I'm a Spanish teacher, so from the language of the science of language, it's a different process, and it does take time.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I
So
don't know
don't
if
feel bad.
my one lesson a day on Duolingo, I don't know if it's going to be able to, it's going to take me like 40 years. I'm going to have to live to be 100 to be able to speak Spanish.
I think you just need the right exposure and the right practice, and who knows, it could happen in a year.
Yeah. I like if I could go live in a Spanish speaking country and be immersed,
Yes,
I think that would accelerate the process considerably.
absolutely. Yeah, that'll change it all. Yeah.
Yeah. So when did you know that you wanted to write fiction?
Um, I think always. I think the thing for me was sort of very tied to language, right? It was a matter of like, well, I don't know that I can write in Spanish anymore. I've sort of really assimilated into my high school life and trying to learn English as much as I could, as fast as I could. Academically, I knew that I wanted to go to college, which meant that I had to become fluent and I had to pass. I had to do well in like state tests, and had to be academically strong. So Spanish sort of took a back seat while I entered this new life. But I knew that I wanted to write. Like I loved writing in high school, and a teacher told me once that I was a good writer, and I sort of held on to that.
I hear that all the time.
A teacher,
A
yeah,
teacher. I mean, it's like,
yeah,
but it's just, I will always say that we are, as human beings, or most of us anyway, incredibly impressionable. I had the exact same thing happen. I had multiple
yeah.
teachers growing up who told me I was good at writing. And that was all I needed. I needed somebody to tell me something I was good at. Like, please. I have no idea
And
personally what
hopefully
I'm good.
match the thing that you like.
Yes. I mean, well, yeah, at least to some degree. And so it's just, I don't know. It's important to realize, like, as teachers or just as adults, how much like of an impact it can have on a kid when you just like pay them a compliment.
Yes, yeah. It really, it's very, yeah. She made me feel like I could, and it came at such a critical time, where I felt like I was, sort of fighting for my life. I was 16, 17 years old and just thinking, I really want to go to college like everyone else. And I have this, what felt like an obstacle just sort of holding me back. Like I was better at producing language on paper than I was at like speaking. Like that sort of came a little slower. And Miss Markowitz, that's her name. She just sort of made me feel really empowered. And yeah, I'll never forget that.
That's wonderful. And
Yeah.
it strikes me that you have been on an accelerated path. Like often when I talk to people who are first generation, they came here at an earlier stage of life.
Mhm.
Like they were, born here or brought here when they were just like a very young child and sort of grew up here and know the States as their only home. But to show up as a freshman in high school and to have a sort of uh, middling grasp of the language, like not fully fluent and, like you say, able
Yeah.
to produce language. And then not that many years later to be publishing a book of fiction in English that is really accomplished. That's incredible.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean,
Thank
and
you.
so to get from high school and to have Miss Markowitz, tell you that you're good at this, but even at that point, you're still not quite at the point where you're able to produce verbal language as easily as you would like.
Right.
What was that? But yet you're writing it pretty proficiently, right?
I was, yeah.
So what was the process? I mean, I'm asking this just out of curiosity as somebody who
Yeah.
wishes to be, bi or trilingual, like what was the process of getting from that level of proficiency to like total comfort in spoken fluency? Like when did that happen for you?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I was so lucky in high school, like even as I couldn't produce language like this, like I had another teacher who like encouraged me to join debate. And it was like, it was so nerve-wracking to like debate as someone who felt really funny about even talking in the first place. But I can't stress this enough. These teachers were just like either, you know, crazy in terms of how optimistic they were. But they sort of like put me in the direction of all the like these little opportunities, and they were like, "Well, you join this, and like you do that, and you practice this and read this." In terms of writing and becoming more proficient, I'm gonna go back to Miss Markowitz, who told me to journal and would say to me all the time, hey, like don't worry about the vocab. It'll come to you organically. Don't try too hard with words. Just like it'll come to you organically. Just keep writing. Like journal everything, journal every day. And I did that. I journaled all the time. We journaled in her class. I journaled more at home. It's really all I did. I just like sort of kept writing and writing and writing and noticing my own writing and evaluating my own writing against other people's writing and understanding that, hey, I don't quite sound like that, but maybe one day I will. Maybe I just need like a few more years. Um, and always trying to remember to not force, you know, um, the vocabulary, and things will come to me organically if I kept going.
You just pick it
Um,
up from conversations with friends or things that you're reading or watching
yeah,
on TV or
TV, books, captioning, um, lots and lots for music. I would say music was just great. Like I loved reading song lyrics then, because like sort of I did have, I don't want to call it a delay in like processing language, but definitely I would understand it better if I could see it. And sometimes like when people would speak to me, it would take me like just a second, or a little longer to like, comprehend what I was listening to. So I relied a lot always on written language. And yeah, I just learned to find what was working for me. I loved alternative rock, and like I could spend hours listening to Pearl Jam and reading every lyric, and like trying to like decipher what people, what Eddie Vedder was writing about, or like listening to like Soundgarden and being like, what is Black Hole Sun? Like, what is that? What is this
I
man
still
saying?
don't know.
Right. Like what is he talking about? But I would really devote so much time to try and figure it out, what these songs were about. And I would just like listen and read and listen and read. That's really all I did. Yeah.
That
Spent a
makes
lot of
sense.
time.
That makes sense, though. You'd have like some sort of emotional understanding of a piece of music just based on the way that it sounds and the inflection of the
Yeah.
singer's voice and all that kind of stuff. So you're like halfway there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Versus like watching, well, maybe not. Maybe you would probably have the same experience watching a movie or a TV show, but reading something you don't have as much emotional information.
Right.
And interestingly, I had a similar conversation with a guest on this show. I believe it was last year. I was talking to B. Seton. I don't know if you know her, or know her work, but she lives in Berlin. She was raised in England. She went to school in the States. Like, it's kind of lived all
Oh,
over and
wow.
is really good at learning languages. And I was having much the same conversation, and she encouraged me to listen to podcasts
Yeah.
in Spanish and like just put them in my ears, even if I don't know what they're talking about,
Yes.
as a way to, so maybe podcasts can be helpful. And that seems like an immersive thing to do, right?
I think so. Totally. I think that any sort of, any exposure that you can give yourself, in a foreign language or just anything really, your brain will start making those connections with time. But you'll develop an ear, and you'll become better at decoding, what you're listening to. But it just takes time, but
Yeah, you got to
doable.
like hear. I have a hard time hearing like the words. It all sounds like one long sound. And it's like at a certain point you start to pick up
Yeah.
the distinct words, and like that just comes with time and exposure. But
Yeah.
it's really impressive to me that you are writing so beautifully in a language that you really only started to like really deal with at age 14. But can you talk about going, like leaving high school and going to college? Like you went straight from high school to college?
I
Is that
did.
right?
I did. Yeah, I started undergrad at Seton Hall University, and I was, thrilled that I got in and very happy. And then I was majoring in journalism because I was dead set on writing. Um, Turned out to be that that wasn't the kind of writing that I wanted to do. Um, I thought I wanted to be a reporter, but I didn't. Always
Why
wanted to
not?
write. I wanted to write fiction, you know, and like I felt it, and like I would be in class and I would write. Like I was writing for the school newspaper, which was really amazing, and I was really proud of myself. But I just sort of I struggled. I was like, oh, this word count, this inverted pyramid, this dry
Yeah.
writing. Like I'm really just telling you what happened. This is awful. I want to write like the things that I'm reading. Uh, yeah, but that was hard to navigate for reasons, you know, that have a lot to do with being an immigrant and then being outside of Newark, even though South Orange is right next to Newark, but not being in my very immigrant high school in my immigrant neighborhood. Suddenly, I'm like in a world where it's like now it's really diverse, right? Now we have people like me, but then we have people who are, Americans from generations and generations and who come from, different places, some of them from suburbs, some of them from like other states. So it felt like, oh, this is a different kind of diversity that I wasn't used to socially. Um, yeah, and that was a hard transition, but somehow it worked.
And you started to write fiction in college?
Experimenting, but I didn't think that I was any good. It wasn't until after undergrad that I read a couple of collections that sort of changed just like they just rocked my world. I was like, whoa,
Which
what is
one?
this?
Which collections were they?
Yeah, I read Drown by Junot Diaz. Um I read Before You Suffocate Your Own Full Self by Danielle Evans. I read Interpreter of Maladies. I read More of This World or Maybe Another by Barb Johnson, who later became my professor at UNO, which was so awesome and unexpected because I'd loved that collection from when I was like young. And then I entered my MFA in my 30s and I was like, it's the same person. Oh my God, I couldn't even be around her. Um,
At the University of New Orleans.
yes. Yeah, I read those short stories and I was just like, well, this is like 10 times better than a novel. Like this is the form. I was like so in love with the form. And I started writing a couple of stories then. But sort of that fear of, am I good enough? Can I be someone who's pursuing arts or literature or fiction? I ended up going into becoming a teacher, which was a much safer career and it felt more fitting. And, I had all the security of a job that I knew I would have and health insurance and all these things. So I stopped writing for a long stretch of time.
When, no, and when was this? Was this after undergrad?
After undergrad, yeah.
And then you become a teacher and you
I
sort of
became
get,
a teacher. I taught for a long time. I wasn't writing. And then as I was approaching my 30th birthday, I sort of wanted to write again. Like I felt just the urge and I felt like I'd cheated myself of something that I should have tried. Like I really did enjoy my time teaching, but I felt like, you work with seniors and you tell them to pursue all these things and you encourage them. You talk about dreams and you talk about possibilities and all these things. You're surrounded in that high school world where everything is very encouraging. If a kid tells me that they're going to be this and that, like I would never say, no, you're not. The likelihood of that is never going to work out. It was always like, you know what, you can do it. Here are the ways. So it felt like, I was saying all those words and not applying a single one of them to myself. So closer to my 30th birthday, I took a workshop at NYU through the School of Professional Studies, so not an MFA class. And I was like, okay, I think let's see if I can write a short story. And I wrote a short story for that. I think it was like a 5 or 6 week fiction workshop. And then after that, I was like, well, what's stopping me from just doing this all the time? Yeah,
So, and then when did you get your MFA at UNO? You said.
I did, but that doesn't happen until a few years after that.
Okay, okay. I'm just
Yeah.
trying to kind of like build the timeline here.
The chronology, yeah. I actually just graduated from my MFA. I graduated last May.
And and these stories that are in your collection are stories
My
that you wrote.
thesis.
They are your thesis.
Yeah.
Look at
Not
you.
all of them, but I want to say maybe 60% of them are.
No, they're really beautifully accomplished stories, and I wonder what it is about the form. I mean, you sort of said that once you started reading short fiction, like a light went on.
Yeah.
And I think this happens with the work that we love oftentimes as writers, is that we read something where not only do we really respond to it and it lights us up, but we also maybe see ourselves in it and our ability to do something similar.
Yeah.
And that was it for you. What was it about short fiction versus like a novel that you found so
Yeah.
much connection to?
I think that it felt, for one, I think that I was reading just the absolutely best collections that I could have encountered, that could sort of, like rival any novel. When you read Danielle Evans, it's like, yeah, these are really good short stories. And I loved the brevity of the form, the immediacy of the form. It felt just challenging. And now that I've written a collection and I've been working on a novel, I can see it's just sort of in terms of craft, a collection really it is really challenging.
Has it sharpened? I can imagine how the compression of short stories and the efficiency with which you need to work could be a good education if you then turn to a novel.
Yeah,
Like, do you feel like you kind of got like your skills got sharpened in a way that is serving you well now that you're working on the novel?
I think so, for sure. I think that, being more aware of limitations, which I think can be wonderful. I think that sometimes the novel can lead to a writer feeling more or less comfortable. And I have found that in myself as I'm writing my novel, where I'm like, well, I can just keep going. Whereas writing a short story, I would tell myself, no, I can't. This is happening now. We're entering this world right now, and we're getting to that story as fast as we can. So I think that there is an inherent pressure to the form of the short story, if it's done right, of course. That I think it's challenging in a different way.
Yeah, I wonder, like, do you feel like you're bringing any of that efficiency to the writing of a novel, or do you think that the novel has to be modulated in a different way? Like, I love when novels work with great efficiency too. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's nothing
Yes,
worse than like a slow, uh,
agreed.
slog of a novel where you're like waiting for something to happen. But is there any like key difference, or can you apply some of the same principles to, say, writing a chapter of a novel, like a chapter functioning
Yeah,
in somewhat similar ways to a story?
I think you can. I think that, I mean, in my experience, I think that sometimes you can get comfortable with a chapter of a novel and not, in terms of plot, sort of drop tension because you have another chapter that will follow where you can pick it up again. Whereas like a short story, if it's a short story that's very much depending on plot, you that tension has to stay there. You don't have a second short story. You have to make it all happen within the length of that one short story. So I think that the novel, and again, this doesn't always happen, but I have found myself thinking, well, I have another chapter and I can keep exploring this. So it's like a challenge to remind myself to keep the same sense of immediacy that I would in a shorter form of writing.
And so you're at UNO, you're getting your MFA, you're working on this collection. I'm imagining you were working on isolated stories at first. And then I think there is a point in every short story collection writer's trajectory where they start to realize they have a potential collection coming together. And I think some of it just simply has to do with the number of stories that you've written. But I think in the really good collections like this one, there's a real thematic unity. And you can feel like the stories are not only assembling in terms of the number of them, but they're also assembling around common themes.
Mm-hmm.
And they feel like they're sort of speaking to one another. Like, at what point did you hit that mark where you're like, okay, this might be a book?
I set out with that mark from the start. So as someone who just loves collections, and always sort of gravitates to that form, I knew I wanted to write about Newark. And I knew, the first couple of stories that I wrote were isolated stories. But I think that by the third story, a friend pointed out that I always wrote about Newark in like those two stories that I shared with like this writing group that I had in Newark. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, like I love writing about this neighborhood.
Why?
And because I couldn't let it go emotionally, it felt so like puzzling to me. And I was just trying to figure out like, why is this neighborhood the way that it is? Why do we exist like this? It was always just a pervasive question. And it felt so wonderful to me that, people like myself and my brother and my peers could be dropped from one country and then be, in this place and could figure things out. And people could take the SAT with their peers and get into college and get these degrees and sort of live this narrative, this immigrant narrative that no one sees, or that it's rarely seen. Not to be necessarily like model minorities or anything like that, but it felt so compelling and so magical that people really made those things happen for themselves, given the number of obstacles and just all the stuff that they just had to go through. So I couldn't, I don't know, I couldn't let that go.
It's the place where your life changed.
Yeah, it is. And for so many of us, it was the same thing. It's like our lives were never the same. Um, and for those of us who were kids, like our lives were so different. But we all had past lives from a different place. So you're growing up and like going through your formative years and negotiating who you are now, who you were then. So I don't know if it was part of my own healing process or my own processing of my own experiences, but I couldn't let go of the neighborhood. By the time that I was done with like two stories or so, I was like, okay, I want to write about Newark. I don't know how to write a novel. I also really love short stories. And so I started to form an idea in my head that, we're going to write about place. I'm writing about a place. And that is going to be sort of my North Star and my vision. And then other themes sort of came later on. But I wanted to write about Newark.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
and
And I
you
was
talk,
also a Philip Roth reader. And I was like, well, the city has changed a lot. And I feel like no one else is writing about it.
okay. It's interesting that you read, I mean, I would imagine
Yeah.
that Philip Roth, was he taught in your high school, or was he like somebody that people talked about in English
Yeah.
class? Or
It was someone that people talked about. And I was in a book club with my friends, and we started our book club, which began with the school year by reading a Philip Roth novel. So
which one?
we started with American Pastoral and just loved it. We loved walking around the neighborhood and being like, "Oh my God, this is where this happened."
Yeah. Right.
That was fun. And then the year after that, we read Sabbath Theater.
Wow. In high
Yeah,
school?
No, no, no. This is when I
Oh,
worked as a teacher. Yeah.
oh, okay, okay, good. I was going to say
I
that
didn't
might be
read
a
any. I didn't read any Philip Roth in high school. No one
okay.
assigned it.
I think Sabbath Theater as a high school reading might be a bit much, but
Yeah,
it's a great book. But um, it's interesting that you talk about Newark with what feels like a lot of affection, and your descriptions of it are mostly positive. Like you seem to like have a positive association,
I do.
and
Yeah,
and yet there is in your collection such a pervasive sadness. A lot of the stories are about people living on the margins. A lot of the stories feel like they are the subtext to lives that maybe outwardly seem happier and more functional than they actually are, which is what I think fiction does such a great job of when it's done well.
yeah,
It often investigates kind of what's happening subsurface or behind closed doors in relationships, which, you never quite know what's going on between two people behind closed doors, no matter how well you know them. You know what I'm saying? Like
yeah.
this book speaks to that. And you have written or said, I don't know if this is from an interview that I read or an essay you wrote, but you say, quote, in my fiction, I write about characters who challenge anti-Blackness and embrace their Blackness with love and compassion for themselves and each other, something that doesn't always come naturally to many of us who have been taught to favor, celebrate, and latch on to our proximity to whiteness. I focus on these themes in my writing because I believe in adding to this much needed conversation. Was this something that was on your mind as you set out to write these stories in much the same way that you knew that you wanted to write about Newark?
Not initially. No. I think that came later on. So I was crafting one specific story in the collection where I was like, yeah, this feels sort of taboo to discuss as, as a Dominican, considering all of the, the racial baggage that we are conditioned to carry.
Which
And
story is
so
it?
the other Carmen.
Oh, okay. So the other
Yeah.
Carmen, just for people listening who have not had a chance to read, is about a girl named Carmen Diaz. I think she's in
Yeah.
college,
Yeah.
and she's sort of obsessed with a porn star named Carmen Diaz. and
Yes.
she's in, and Carmen is in college, and she is in a kind of love triangle of sorts
Yeah.
with a guy named Evan, and then is it her cousin Nicole?
Yes.
Okay, so like
Yeah.
she and Evan kissed once, but now
Yeah.
Evan is in a relationship with Nicole. It's sort of an odd situation. And what is it about that particular story that you associate so much with the passage that I just read of yours, where you're talking about kind of racial identity and the baggage that you carry with you, like you said, from uh, the DR and all the rest of it?
Yeah. I think that the character of that story, is constantly comparing herself to her cousin, who is thinner, who is, whose skin is lighter, whose hair texture is different. So there's a lot of internalized anti-blackness, or a lot of sort of, internalized feelings of inferiority that come from looking different than her cousin. So I think that when I was writing that story, I thought, okay, I've been writing about place, and I think that these stories give people a good sense of where we are and what the city looks like. And then I thought, we could also just go in a little deeper. Why not? So I started to explore, themes like blackness, and in that particular story, body image, and all those things associated within, Dominican culture.
Well, there is a lot of grief. Like the two themes that I underline: unhappy relationships,
Yeah.
where people like the difficulties between men and women in particular, or boys and girls, where they're just misfiring, miscommunicating, being insensitive to one another's needs, being mismatched. Sometimes that's just part of it, where it's just not a good match. But I couldn't help but notice that. And then there are also uh, a lot of stories where people are feeling deep grief,
Yeah.
deep senses of loss, like powerfully so. And yet, before I characterize this collection as being sort of like inescapably dark and sad, there are stories that are just wonderful when it comes to like mixing the dark and the light, and mixing that deep sadness and that grief and that dissatisfaction, whatever it is, with maybe even like just the faintest bit of hope or some whisper of a promise of like a page turning or a new chapter unfolding in a person's life. And so I think of the story Bear Hunting Season.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, where is she getting this? Like, where are you getting this? Are you just pulling this whole cloth out of your imagination? Because it's about a widow
Yeah.
who kind of starts like online dating and meets this guy. I think his name's Henry.
Yes.
And he's like, you want to go hunting with me? And I'm just like, what? I'm like, what is this? Can you talk about that story's genesis? Because it's a really lovely story, and it's very acutely drawn, and it has a lot of emotional intelligence in it. And for somebody as young as you to be writing like the widow's experience in online dating, I found that impressive, because that's
Thank you.
a pretty big leap.
Yeah. Oh, that story. Yeah. My novel is actually an expansion of that world.
Oh,
Yeah. So I was done with what I thought was a collection. I was like, okay, I've written about Newark. Cool. It's like my second year of my MFA. And I was like, I wrote a book. I have a book. And then it was like time to go back into workshop. And I kept on sort of thinking that, what would happen if I just like got a little weird? And that became sort of like my motto that year. I was like, you know, let's get weird.
so
um,
how many stories did you write in the weird mode?
in the weird mode, I want to say definitely bear hunting season. And while I was in the weird mode, I rewrote the fake wife from what it was to what it is, the last story.
I love
Even though
that.
the story,
I love that story. We're going to talk
even
about that
though,
story.
okay, even though it wasn't necessarily like, it's not a weird story, but I was in a sort of very playful and explorative, weird mood. Um,
Which can be a good place to be as a fiction
yeah.
writer.
Yeah. I was like, I had, I thought that had written all these stories. And then I was like, okay, so like, what can I do now? I've written about teenagers quite a bit. I work at a high school. I want to get out of that world. Want to write about just more, I guess, older characters. And I think, yeah, this wasn't supposed to happen. That story was part of that weird sort of sequence. Bear hunting season and the fake wife role and worry bees were all part of like, I wanted to get weird. Um, but when I was writing bear hunting season, yeah, I was just like, I wanted to be weird. And I kept on talking about that story with one of my classmates and telling him, it's like, it's just not weird enough. She's just not weird enough. And I kept on sort of being like, the essential question I kept on going back to. I was like, no, it's like, she's got to be a little more weird. Um, and I kept on coming up with like different ideas of like, no, this she's not devastated enough. It's not weird. I turn this up to 11. We're gonna get weird as hell. Um,
But the thing is, you say this, and I don't want to give away the game for this story, because I think part of
right.
the fun of reading this story is sort of finding out what happens to this widow and her new online dating like
Yeah.
boyfriend or whatever. But um, I don't feel like it's that weird what happens. I feel like there's an
Yeah.
emotional intelligence to what happens, even though like on the surface it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of weird, but not when you know the context.
I I would hope so, yes. I'm
Yeah.
glad that you feel that way
Yeah,
about
no, I
it.
mean, because if it was
Yeah.
truly just weird, I think the story wouldn't be satisfying. It would just be weird, right?
Right, right.
But sometimes people do weird shit, and sometimes,
Yes.
wounded people, it can manifest all sorts of different ways, and people can be very unpredictable, especially I think when they are emotional, or if they are, say, dealing with deep grief.
Yeah. Yeah. I kept on, you know, It took me a long time to write that story. It's one of the stories that it took me possibly the longest. I kept on just writing it and rewriting it and rewriting it, and not quite finding the right sequence of events. It took me a while. I
Do you think it's because you were writing outside of your range of experience a bit?
I think so. I mean, I'm not a widow. I was drawing from some deep heartbreak that felt, some romantic heartbreak that felt like I had lost someone, like that person had died. But he didn't die. It
Well,
just
that's
felt that
nice.
way.
But
That's
hey,
good to
listen,
know.
that's how breakups feel. It is a kind of death.
Yeah, it felt like I was grieving the death of so many things. So I pulled from a little bit from that emotional pain that I was feeling. And then at some point tried to separate myself from, from the story. I was like, I'm not a widow. I'm not doing what Nina is doing in the story. There is no dating site for, bereaved spouses. And I sort of tried to get inventive about, making shit up.
Well, there's a real like what I always call a creative courage in these stories because they go to really intimate places. Like these stories really go there. And I always appreciate that in fiction. There's a lot of sex in this collection.
Yeah.
It's not always like a happy affair either. You know what I'm saying? In fact, it
Yeah.
frequently isn't. And yet you don't shy away from those private moments. And I think that's what fiction is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to shine a light on stuff that often goes unseen or
Yeah.
unspoken about. And you get to be, as I was getting towards the end of this collection, I will often lament, not just in reading your book, but in reading books in general, at how badly relationships between men and women can be. Men in particular do not fare well in contemporary fiction, in my reading of it anyway. I'm always just like, man, guys, got to get it together. But it's like,
Right. Yeah.
it's not happening.
Yeah.
And then I read The Fake Wife. And the fact that you place that story at the end of the collection, and I guess this is going to be a little bit of a spoiler. So if you don't want any spoilers, you might not want to listen to this segment. But The Fake Wife, I just loved because it is an unexpected love story.
Yeah.
And it was just a sweet story. And I have to believe, and I felt like, oh, this is a writer who's got like a real sense of her collection and like the ride that she's kind of taking the reader on. It was just beautifully placed.
Thank you.
I needed that story at the end.
I think
I
we
needed
did. I
someone
think
to
we all
fall.
need.
I
We
needed
needed that
someone
at
to
the end.
fall in love. Yeah, I needed someone to fall in love, and I
We
needed it
needed
to
a
be
palate cleanser.
yes. But it was just. I don't know. I felt like it kind of like made the collection for me. It like was the exact right note to end on, which, kind of touched on this earlier. When you're writing a story collection, it's not just accumulating. I mean, I guess it could be this, but usually the really good ones have a thematic unity and have like a conversation happening between them. And in order for a collection to feel whole, it seems like the stories have to be doing different things. They have to be playing different variations on these themes.
Yeah.
And The Fake Wife played the variation that I wanted right at the moment when it happened in the collection, which was at the end. So kudos to you. Good instincts. Like
Thank you.
it was very satisfying and a very sweet story and a great premise for a story, where I'll give people just the setup. We won't tell them anything else. So I guess they sort of
Okay.
have a sense. But it's a guy goes down to the Dominican Republic for, what is it, a bachelor party?
Yeah.
And he's down there and he meets a bartender who works at the resort where he's staying. And she wants a green card to come to the United States and basically offers to pay him money to marry her.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's a good setup.
Thank you.
So
I
I
had
don't
a
know.
blast writing that story. I should say rewriting that story.
what changed? I mean, was it always kind of the
So
arc?
much.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So originally, this was a flash piece. It was just 1,000 words. Um, and it moved really quickly. And it was like, it almost read like a poem. Um, and then I had already won the prize and everything. We had already
This is
edited.
the Merriweather Prize?
Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
what is that prize? Like, what is it attached to? Or
so it's the Feminist Press. It's their prize for women and non-binary people of color. After Louise Merriweather. Um, yeah,
well,
and
kudos to you.
thank you. I had already won the prize, and we were already editing. I had already received my edits for the story, and I reached out to my editor and I asked to be allowed to include a couple more stories because I felt like the collection needed them, and then to rewrite the fake wife. Um, and so, very gracious as she is, she said yes. And then I started rewriting, and I just felt like I felt like I had cheated Chris, the main character, out of like a storyline that was worthy of the person that I thought he was at heart. I was like, this is a good guy.
Yay!
He
There's at
deserves more.
least one.
This is a good man. He deserves more.
Right.
This man deserves more, and I was just like, I'm not gonna be okay if I do not rewrite like I have to rewrite the story. And anyway, I went on this delightful journey of rewriting this story. I was just like, we're gonna start from scratch, like throw it all out. We're just gonna start brand new. Yeah, and I started from scratch, and then it's just like it went from like 1,000 words to like 12,000 words, and I was like, oh my god, I'm still going. I gotta like reel it back in. This now it's like a bit much.
You went from Flash to this is too much.
Yeah, it was like okay, I'm like for a second there, I was like, oh my god, should I just like forget this and then just make this a novel? Like I was having such a fun time. I was also done with the MFA, so this was I started it was last summer I started rewriting it, and the collection had already like I already had my edits, so it felt very you know um, explorative and playful and weird. And my editor was so kind that she was like, okay, well let's see. um, and so yeah, I just kept writing and hoping to do this character justice. We had sort of considered other stories to end the collection with, but I felt like those wouldn't have been the right ones. It felt like it had to be the fake wife and it had to be better. um, and then in my mood of weird, weird to
Was
me,
this part of the weird too? Was the fake wife?
this is part of the weird sequence.
Sure.
Uh, weird for me because I felt like I wanted to write. I kept on making jokes and telling my friends, I was like, I think I'm writing a love story. I think I'm writing a love story. And I like felt so, felt weird to me. Um, Not a love story writer. And I was just like, oh, this is going to be a little happier. And I think this is going to be slightly romantic and it's going to be weird in that way.
But
And
listen,
I
I
just,
got to stop you. We need more of this. We need more of this. I think there's obviously a place for sad stories. We go to fiction to grapple with the tough stuff of life as writers. I think that's totally normal and totally fine and totally great. But I think that writing like really nuanced, emotionally intelligent love stories needs to happen more often.
I
I don't.
agree.
I loved it. You must have enjoyed it as a writer. I can feel you
I loved
enjoying.
it. I
Yeah.
loved writing it. I loved writing it. I have to say it was the funnest thing I've ever written. It felt for many different reasons. Again, like I was done with the MFA. I knew I didn't have to turn this into a workshop and no one was going to read it and, workshop it in class. And I knew the collection was already done and I already had my edits, and it felt like I had almost like reached out to a parent and be like, can I play a little longer? Like, can I stay, can I stay out a little longer? Would you let me?
Yeah. I'm having fun at this
And
party.
can I just stay out a little longer? And it felt like, not to compare my editor to a parent, but it felt that way. It felt like I was asking for a little more time for my curfew to be extended. And when she said yes, I was like, yes. She said yes. Let's
Well,
do this.
that's a good that's a fortunate move because I feel like
She was great. It's a
well,
great
but this
editor.
this story is the perfect ending note for the collection.
Thank you.
Just perfect. And it makes me think of something else I wanted to say about the collection, which is that you are writing into so many different characters, so many different kinds of lives, socioeconomically,
Hmm.
racially, gender, experiential. Like you really don't have any boundaries or limitations there in ways that I think really good writers often do. Like there are really good writers who really don't have that kind of range. And it's okay. They usually write like first person narratives that are narrated by somebody who's kind of close to them in terms of their
Hmm.
life. And that stuff happens. But you are all over the place. And it feels like the kind of thing that squares with what you were talking about earlier in terms of your relationship to Newark and its unique quality as a real, like, kind of melting pot.
Hmm.
Like, I think somebody who grew up around so many different kinds of people and so many different lives and narratives and experience would be best suited to write a story collection that encompasses all of that. That's the world that you come from, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Were there any particular challenges or any hesitation that you had when it comes to, like, there's a story called The World as We Know It,
Yeah.
where you're writing into the lives of white people
Yeah.
living in an apartment in an unhappy relation, like maybe the unhappiest relationship in the whole book. I don't know. I'd have to like think about it, but it's not going well. And
Yeah.
uh, I'm just curious about like that experience. And you kind of read about this or hear about this, like usually on social media when it comes to art, and it
Hmm.
always causes me to bristle
Yeah.
when people talk about like, well, you shouldn't be writing that because that's not your life or experience. I mean, obviously you want to do it in a way that's respectful and that's like reaching towards truth or something. But like, I'm of the position that like writers and artists should have license to be
Yeah.
creative and to write in the direction of their imagination and their deepest concerns. You just talk about like that part of it, whether it's writing into the lives of white people in the world as we know it. We talked about bear hunting season, where you're writing into the life of a widow who's considerably older, writing into the lives of people who are dealing with substance abuse. In the story, What Is Yours? You have a mom who's dealing with like heavy substance abuse, and there's impacts
Hmm.
that this has on her child. And you know, did you ever struggle with a sense of like, do I have the authority to be writing
Yeah.
this stuff?
Yeah, totally. I thought, yeah, for sure. Especially when I was writing the world as we know it, which originally was the end of the world as we know it. Um, I thought it would be. I was like, well, I'm gonna write a story from the first person point of view of a white guy. And at first, like I started writing and I was like cracking myself up, like it was funny to me. And then I had to stop several times and think, okay, well, I don't want to write a caricature. Like this is a person, so this character deserves humanity, and it felt important to me to write from that perspective because I'm writing about Newark and I was writing about the neighborhood, and it felt like I can't leave that one component of that resident out of the picture. It wouldn't feel authentic or true to the modern contemporary Newark that I know, and that a lot of us are living, or we're I don't live in Newark anymore, but we're in the middle of that. So I I knew it would be risky, and I knew I would probably get some shit for it. And I kept going back. Um, the challenge was also, making sure that this came across as a person,
Which it
even
definitely did.
even if he's like not the nicest, most appealing person. And same thing for Joy, his girlfriend in the story. I wanted to, I was like, I'm walking this line, and I'm talking about politics, and I don't want to preach, but if like it has to be true to the collection and the world that characters are living through, and it has to be told from this perspective because otherwise that wouldn't be true to what I was trying to accomplish in terms of Newark, a character. Yeah, it was not easy to write, and it took many tries, but it was fun.
You did it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think like that's another thing that great fiction does is it takes risks and it
Yeah.
goes there. And I think if you're writing with Newark as like this sort of foundational piece, then and to have this sort of what's the word? It's like a cornucopia of characters who sort of people this place.
Hmm.
There are white people in Newark, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if you're going to if you want the collection to be representative of Newark, it makes creative sense to go there in at least one of the stories or a couple of the
Yeah.
stories.
Especially with the themes, like I do start the story with, I mean, the collection with a story that does mention gentrification. And we have this character, Eva, who feels very much, an outsider. And it's like, the, the collection, that story ends with just observations of this place that could be more beautiful. And so it felt like I would be doing a disservice to the collection if I avoided a topic because it was difficult, or if I avoided a specific point of view because it was difficult. So I kept on sort of asking myself, why, which is what I would say to anyone writing from any perspective, why, and if you can justify that why. And I think that if there is a larger purpose and it's not, gratuitous in some way, just because you're trying something new, or because whatever reasons, I think that, yeah, give yourself license.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like there's got to be a why justification that
Yeah.
is solid and makes sense, like creative sense. And if there is, then go for it.
Yeah, I think that those risks are perfectly fine if there's a reason why. And if, as you're writing the work, if you're not going to perpetuate, um, you know, misinformation, or if it's not going to be hurtful, I think that those are important questions to ask yourself as a writer. And I thought I would ask myself that and say, will this, hurt anyone? I don't think it will. Will this be true to what I'm trying to say in terms of, the story of a place? I was like, yeah, this would be a key component to that story. And it would be weird to not do it.
Yeah, well, it's beautifully done. And
Thank you.
I'm just really impressed with this collection and blew through it. And I know you've spoken already about the fact that you're working on a novel
Mhm.
next. How far along is the book? Like, do you have a manuscript close to being done or?
I would say maybe 60%. Knowing myself and just how I love a good rewrite. I don't think I'm anywhere near done,
Yeah, but
but who knows?
it takes its time, you know.
Yeah,
And do we have a title, like a working title? And do we
we do.
have?
Yeah.
Will you are
Uh,
you willing to share
yeah. The working title right now is What We Might Have Been.
what we might have been? And you said it was an extension in some ways, at least thematically, of bear hunting season. Is that right?
Yeah, the character, Nina, the widow.
Nina's actually in the novel.
The novel is about her. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. I
Yeah.
thought it was
Yeah.
just like a furtherance of the theme, the thematic exploration, but this is
No,
actually
it's
about.
about that character. Yeah.
Is she and Henry, are they still an item in the novel? Can I ask that?
Uh, you can totally ask that, but I don't have an answer for that
Okay.
yet.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know in which direct. I mean, I know we're moving backwards in time. Um, so we see more of the relationship between her and her husband before what we know is going to happen, which is he's going to die.
Do you have a sense of why you're interested in further exploring this character versus other characters that you might have written about in the collection?
Yeah, I think that it sort of happened organically. So like after I wrote bear hunting season, titled as originally The Widow, um, I kept on thinking about this character and I kept on imagining her younger. And I started writing stories about her, like when she was in high school and then later in life. So I tried to picture her life outside of being a widow. It's like, what is this person beyond, someone's wife? Um, and I allowed myself a little, exploration and time to play. And then I began with one story, and then I wrote two, and then I wrote three. And then I was like, well, this feels like there's an arc here. We just have to get clever about organizing it. Um, yeah, it
So
just
wait, you
felt,
started to feel like it was a novel.
yeah, I kept writing stories about the same character, and it felt like I was, you know, a lot of it is going to be about her and her mom. But I felt that there was an arc to that, to what I was writing. So I kept pursuing it.
For those of you listening, a great way to trick yourself into writing a novel is to just keep writing stories about the same character,
I think so. Yeah.
right? Well, I wish you well on it, and I
Thank
congratulate
you.
you on your collection. It's really wonderful, and I can't wait to read the next one. So, best of luck seeing your way through, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk.
Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure to talk to you. This was fun.